Welcome back. You're listening to Ram Jam on 3MDR with me, Russ. It's just gone past 3 o'clock. It's 3:06 here on the 3MDR clock. And before I introduce to you my next guest speaker, I'm going to just give you a little bit of background about where this is sort of what some of the foundation is around this this discussion. I did have Ed Kelly on the show a few weeks ago, so that was part one of the interview. In my personal opinion, part two really starts to take off in a really interesting direction. But yeah, once again, I'll just get into what this is all about. A lot of this is really focusing around what's known as the hard problem, or the mind-brain problem, which really is about consciousness, which of course consciousness is an undeniable fact. It really is there. We actually do experience life and existence, but we can't account for it with the current models or the scientific models of reality. In physics, we can experience a world of physical elements, matter, forces, energy, charges, atoms and molecules, but we have nothing to explain the existence of consciousness. The most common model or assumption that we have is called the production model, which basically says that the complexity of physical structures in the brain give rise to consciousness. And we can see the close correlation between the brain and the mind because alterations in the brain correlate with changes in mental function. But there's also another model called the transmission model, where consciousness is filtering through or transmitting through the brain and can act independently, as the evidence shows. One of the great founders of quantum physics, Max Planck, and numerous others in the scientific field have made the point that consciousness is more fundamental in the universe than matter. We can examine matter, we can pull it apart, we can see what it is, we can see what it's made of, and do things with it, but we can't get behind consciousness. So let's talk about the evidence and investigation into this field. That's what this conversation is all about. So I'd like to introduce to you today's guest speaker, Dr. Edward Kelly, and I'll tell you a bit about his background. So he has a BA in psychology from Yale and a PhD from Harvard University in psycholinguistics and cognitive neuroscience. Dr. Kelly has spent essentially his entire career of about 50 years in neuroscience and scientific investigation of psychical phenomena, or the field known as parapsychology. He worked at J.B. Ryan's Institute for Parapsychology, the Department of Electrical Engineering at Duke, as well as other research institutions. And now, for the last 18 years, he's been a research professor in the the Department of Psychiatric Medicine, and particularly within the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. That's since 2002. His main areas of interest are the mind-brain problem and cognitive neuroscience, and he's produced a large body of peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters, and he's headed up 3 major publications, which we talked about in quite some detail in the previous part of the interview, which was a few weeks ago. If you want to go back to the podcast and stream that, you can have a listen to that. And it's not just him. He's been alternatively in a team of 5 other PhD academics, and in the case, so that was with the first book that came out in 2007. That's sort of like a massive book, by the way, called Irreducible Mind. And then there was another book that came out in 2015 with 14 academics called Beyond Physicalism. Dr. Edward Kelly, who prefers to go by Ed, is clearly a very distinguished specialist and one of the top academics in the world for the scientific investigation of parapsychology and looking into the real nature of consciousness and the self. So I have felt very honoured and privileged to have Dr. Edward Kelly join me on Ram Jam. It has been a real joy to do that, and I was very happy to hear that he also enjoyed being interviewed by me. But I am going to kick on now. It is pre-recorded, and I'm going to play that for you right now. Okay, so let's swing back around and get a little bit of an understanding around your personal story, if we may. So it's quite an unusual step for a scientifically minded person with your background, with a Harvard PhD in psycholinguistics.
Yeah.
All right, you're a scientist. And then to start getting interested in parapsychology, paranormal, psi-phenomena, whatever you like to call it. Mm-hmm. How did that all come about?
All right. Well, I was working on my dissertation. It was late in graduate school, probably 1967 or 68, something like that. And I got a call one day from my mother, who informed me that my only sibling, an older sister, had become a medium. And clearly, she was calling me to kind of find out whether she needed to be worried about this. You know, since I was a graduate student in psychology, I would obviously know all about it. But of course, I didn't know a thing about it. I mean, I vaguely knew that William James had an interest in that subject, but I didn't know anything about it.
So she was thinking that possibly, your sister, this is, right?
Yeah.
That she was having a psychosis or something like that. That was probably her suspicion.
It might be something bad that she should be worried about.
Gotcha.
She was hoping to reassure herself. Anyway, so I then proceeded to look into this, and I did enough of it to feel confident that there was nothing obviously terrible. And I actually made arrangements to go sit in on a couple of my sister's sittings that she did. She had joined up a thing called the Spiritual Frontiers Fellowship, kind of a pan-Christian sort of religious group that uses mediumship as a big part of its services. So my sister, for example, would be sitting there in the middle of the circle, and at a certain time, ostensible spirits would arrive to convey messages about things to do and not do and so on. And it all seemed pretty benign, so I quickly kind of calmed my mother down.
Yeah.
And I still feel fine about that. But in the process, I also became aware, much more than I had been, that there's a big section of the library, several long shelves containing journals in which people are publishing articles, often experimental articles, about things that up until that time I had not taken seriously. Okay,
and so what was when you noticed the extent of the literature that was there, did you kind of wonder, God, why is there so much shelf space taken up by this bunch of claptrap?
Well, I didn't put it quite that way, but I was amazed to see it there because I had no prior inkling that there was any such body of literature. I mean, It's really quite large. And a lot of it, the stuff that I gravitated to, was of the same sort of stuff that I was being taught to do in graduate school. Experimental reports in which evidence is presented of the same kinds that I was seeing in other psychology articles, purporting to support the existence of these phenomena that I felt quite sure should not happen if the worldview that up to that time were correct.
So in other words, when you saw the discipline and the rigor and the scientific approach, that these were educated and trained men and women who understood the process of an academic and scientific investigation into a phenomenon and knew how to report on it, and with all looking at things from all angles, all that sort of stuff.
Yeah, all the usual
stuff. You could
stuff.
see the quality, right? You could see the quality of their work, and then that was what made you start to go, well, there might be something interesting here.
Yeah,
right.
And I should say that at the same time, I was undergoing a sort of a crisis in my professional life. I did a dissertation attempting to use computers to discriminate the main meanings of high-frequency words in English.
Oh, yeah.
And I mean, the project that I worked on, this was reasonably useful, practical contribution. But in the course of doing that work, I became convinced that no computer was ever going to be able to use language in the way that we humans do. It has to do with metaphor and the centrality of metaphor to practically all uses of language, the ability to apply words creatively to novel circumstances. I mean, the sort of thumbnail summary of it is that no computer, in my estimation, will ever be able to distinguish between metaphorical truth and literal falsehood. And this, to me, was a fundamental problem, the existence of which I had not suspected. I went into that project, being a huge fan of the computational theory of the mind, that minds are just computer programs running on this hardware of the brain,
Yep.
that sort of thing. And I came out of this being profoundly skeptical about all that, and I still am. My expected professional path is just kind of dried up, basically petered out as far as I was concerned. And now this new stuff comes along that's extremely interesting. And so I attempted to read some of that while I was finishing off my dissertation. And then I actually spent another, about 9 months in a postdoc up there. I was working in computational linguistics, sort of an extension of my dissertation. But actually, I was spending a lot of time in the library reading this other stuff and getting more interested in it. Started corresponding with J.B. Ryan down in Durham. He was the guy who had sort of really launched the main center of experimental parapsychology in the United States. He started at Duke University in the psychology department. Long story about that. But he had recently retired and moved across campus, so to speak, set up a private research institute. Anyway, so I corresponded with him some and eventually went down and did an interview and decided, well, if this stuff is for real, it has big implications for how we think about the nature of reality. And that sounds interesting to me. So I decided to do it. I did the usual, 6-month trial period, $400 a month stipend. That was the deal. And then if you pass that test, you could stay on for a while. And that's what I did.
And what about, did you have any trepidation about the implications this might have to your own career in terms of, getting marginalized, getting ridiculed and all that sort of thing?
I had some of that, but probably not enough, to be honest. I mean, I was very, young, idealistic kind of guy. I figured, truth wins in science, and that's just how it is. Yeah, right.
If only.
Didn't know much history of science, you might say. Yeah, but I just didn't think about it very much. Teenagers think they're immortal and that sort of stuff. Guys just out of graduate school think, they can do whatever they want. And so, no, I did not think about it as much as I probably should have. But,
any regret? I'm detecting a tone of some regret there, perhaps, that, you've possibly thought, I could have done so much better for myself if I had taken just one of the really mainstream sort of pathways.
Well, I had some advice from several people that I would now pass on to other young people who are thinking about this decision. It's certainly strategically wiser to become established in some, mainstream area, and only then, indulge your interest in this other stuff, because I've had a pretty weird ride.
I can imagine. Sorry, what was that last bit?
Survived it.
You survived it.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
A lot of ups and downs.
And so on that whole journey, like in the last, so we're going way back to the early 70s and up until now. So it's been a career path that spanned 50 years.
Yes.
Can you pinpoint any particular moments where you had major aha moments that really were eye-opening for you? Okay,
well, there was a big one early on. When I got to the Rhine place, this is the first week of 1972, I started looking at the library of the Institute for Parapsychology. And I began reading, actually, from the proceedings of the Society for Psychical Research, starting in 1882 and creeping forward little by little. After about a month of that, got a call from one of my undergraduate teachers who had discovered what he thought was a gifted subject. Kind of a long story of how this all came to pass, but ultimately, this person, who was then a first-year law student at Yale, came to visit. Yeah, he came down, I guess it was around the beginning of February, if I remember right, and stayed in my house with me for about 6 weeks. But let me just describe what happened the very first day I met him. I collected him from the bus station or somewhere and brought him to the laboratory. We all sat down, the whole staff, including J.B. Ryan, his wife Louisa, Helmut Schmidt, who was at the time the research director there, all the other researchers, and Bill Delmore and myself. We sat down at the table in the library. Now, Helmut Schmidt was a physicist by training. He had worked for Boeing for many years, but had become the research director for J.B. Rhine. And he had, what endeared him to Rhine was that he had built an electronic tester for psiability. It consisted of a box, maybe so big, so thick, and on the top of it were 4 large colored lights and 4 correspondingly colored buttons. And the point of this device is that, subject's task is to try and choose the target that the machine is randomly selecting. And the way it works is extremely sophisticated. What happens is the subject makes a decision, pushes a button, and at that instant, an electronic switch that's stepping through the 4 lights at millions of times per second is interrupted by the arrival of the next decay particle from a radioactive source inside the machine, a little lump of strontium that Helmut had secreted inside the middle of this thing.
So it's a genuine randomizer, is that?
Yeah, it's as random as anything you can get anywhere, truly random. And in the absence of a subject, this thing always passed all tests of randomness with room to spare. Now, Helmut had spent, while he was still working at Boeing, he had spent a couple of years scouting around for people who could do this task. And he had found 2 people who could reliably score deliberately either above chance or below chance, an interesting feature, with a tiny success rate, like a couple of percent above or below the 25% you'd expect by chance. Okay, so the device is sitting there on the table in the library. We come in, Bill sits down, "What's that?" and points to the box. And Helmut gave him a brief explanation. This clearly challenged him right away. And so over the next hour and something, Bill proceeded to tell us his kind of life story. And every so often he'd reach out and press a button. And I wasn't keeping very exact score, but I knew he was well above 25%. And I could see that Helmut was getting increasingly excited. And to keep a long story short, by the end of this conversation, he had, I think it was 180 hits in 508 trials, which is over 35%. And I mean, when you do the math on that, something like that or better would happen by chance, like 1 in 10 million reruns of the 508 trials. And in effect, we could have sat there waiting for millions of hours for that to happen by chance. So right away, this guy showed excellent evidence of having something very unusual. And basically, he went on, we worked with him for a month then. Then we managed to get a small grant from Harvard University, actually, from a hardly ever used fund up there for some research, and had Bill take a year's leave of absence from law school. He came and worked with us in Durham, and we carried out a series of additional tests of various kinds, including a lot of things with playing cards. So this guy, I mean, that moment was really an aha moment, but it was then the next year and a half or so.
So you witnessed this for yourself. It's very different to reading about it in other people's reports and books.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, I was nearly convinced by what I had read, but to see it right in front of your face is just different. And
absolutely.
This time, I am now totally convinced that these phenomena exist as a fact of nature. And somehow we're going to have to modify our science or our worldview in order to allow them to happen. What's
the best case that you've ever heard about of someone being able to? What would you call that? It's not telepathy? Is it? Are we talking about precognition here in this case?
Well, these terms are very slippery. Let's maybe we should spend a moment on that. The main line of division is between what you might call input phenomena, information coming from outside into a person, and these include things like telepathy, perhaps, which is normally defined as direct awareness of thoughts or whatever going on in another person's mind, clairvoyance, awareness of some remote state of affairs, precognition, knowledge of future events, retrocognition, knowledge, direct knowledge of past events that you had no written information about, for example. And then the other big category, of course, is psychokinetic or telekinetic effects, where persons are having an influence on the environment. And in both cases, the idea is that there's some sort of a barrier that would prevent those things from happening in any ordinary way that we can explain in terms of sort of classical physical ideas.
Yep.
A barrier. Now, the terms are very unsatisfactory because they typically have all kinds of sort of extra baggage, theoretical connotations that we'd rather ignore. So at a certain point, people propose the word psi as a kind of blanket designator for the whole lot, sometimes divided into psi gamma for input phenomena, psi kappa for output phenomena. So I will use psi or paranormal or psychic phenomena to mean all of those things. And experimentally, they, particularly among the input phenomena, they turn out to be very hard to discriminate in a clear and consistent way experimentally. There's a long story about this that we really just can't get into. But for example, telepathy, the British, F.W.H. Myers, one of the founders of the SPR, invented the word telepathy, and they were very interested in that. They tended to think of things in terms of telepathy. And not to do many experiments, although experimental ideas were definitely present from the earliest days of the SPR. Now, here comes J.B. Ryan, a farm boy from Ohio, as compared with these very upper crusty Brits. And he's revolutionizing the field by introducing experiments and making them the center of everything. And I think he also got a certain kind of charge out of rejecting the British emphasis on telepathy as the primary subject and was pushing clairvoyance instead. In a lot of cases, you can't distinguish between them experimentally at all. If someone is sitting there looking at a target, is it his mentation or the presence of the target in front of him that allows the subject who's in a remote location to figure out what the target is? Stuff like that. So lots of arguments in the literature, particularly back in the 40s to say 60s or 70s, something like that. Now, there are lots of impressive things in the literature, and I have to say that they're not all experimental. There tend to be kind of two camps in the world of psychical research. There's the experimental camp, which tends to be very aggressively promoting the idea that our experiments are the only way to generate scientific knowledge. And then there are a lot of other people, starting with the founders of the SPR, and certainly extending to people like I work with at DOPS, who have emphasized the importance of spontaneous real-world phenomena, which tend to be much more dramatic, large-scale kinds of things. They're inherently unpredictable, uncontrollable. They're not like experiments in that way. So there's kind of constant trade-off within the field between spectacular things or more spectacular things that happen in spontaneous contexts, usually or often in situations where there's a lot of affect involved. People are dying or having accidents or things of that sort, versus experimental work. Yes. Yeah.
So, of course, those spontaneous cases, which are not under experimental conditions, would be subject to the criticism that, it's not controlled and it's just essentially anecdotal.
That's a terrible expression. I mean, that's a cheap defense of skepticism. I mean, a lot of these spontaneous cases have been investigated in enormous detail. Skeptics need to become better acquainted with the literature before they begin expressing opinions of that sort, in my opinion. If you look, for example, at Ian Stevenson's reports of cases of the reincarnation type, small children who begin speaking and acting as though remembering events from a previous life. No one can read that stuff and pretend that these are, quote, anecdotes. These are carefully investigated, very detailed, very complicated, spontaneous cases where he, documented everything that can possibly be documented, sometimes only through enormous efforts of scholarship and detective work and sometimes very difficult settings. I mean, it's an enormous body of scholarship that deserves respect.
Okay, all right, I consider myself told.
But getting back to some, examples of spectacular performances. This guy that I worked with, Bill Delmore, we did a long series of card guessing with him using playing cards because he didn't like ESP cards. He liked the relative rarity of chance hits with playing cards. The chance of a hit is 1 in 52 instead of 5 or something like that, or 1 in 4. And that enabled him, when he got a hit, knew he had done something, and he could sort of sort his internal cues. Well, this guy, over a series of, 46 times 52, whatever that is, 2,900 and something trials, spread over about a 6-month period, got exact hits at 3 times chance expectation, very large excess of number hits also. And there were exactly 20 occasions during that series of experiments where he felt sufficiently confident that he had it right, that he said so in advance. And we made note of that and then looked at those separately. So in those 20 trials, 14 were exact hits, and the other 6 were all near misses. 5 of them were number hits where he got the suit wrong, but actually 4 of those 5, he had the color right. Said club when it was spade or something of that sort. And the last one was a suit hit in which he missed the number by a couple of positions. So he was right on him every time when he had that special feeling of that was a good one.
Do you ever do things like set people up with EEG scans of their brains while this is going on?
What a wonderful suggestion. Let me just put in one more piece of this Bill Delmore story, and then we'll get back to that. We developed early on the sense that for this guy, visual imagery was a big part of what he was doing. He's an extremely visual kind of person. He reported remembering 10 or 12 dreams a night. He could remember events back very early into his childhood. He had a whole lot of characteristics of a syndrome that later acquired a name. It's the Geschwin-Garabuda or something like that syndrome. And it has to do with hemispheric dominance and all this. But anyway, so what we saw is that he's using this visual imagery a great deal. So what we did, the next thing we did experimentally, we added a component to this ongoing ESP study with him where we had him look at slides of the playing cards, but exposed very fast so that he made a lot of mistakes. And what we were interested to see was whether the structure of the mistakes in the ESP task looked like the structure in the visual task. And lo and behold, it did. It was amazing. He mixed up face cards, particularly ones of the same color. He mixed up the ones with just a few things on them. And he mixed up the ones in the middle in a more complicated kind of way. But the structures were remarkably similar. And what we interpreted that as meaning is that in a short period before he makes a response, he is observing an image. It can start anywhere in its visual field. It can be big, it can be small, it can be well colored, it can be poorly colored, it can be real clear and sharp or fuzzy, move fast or slow. They differ in lots of ways, and they shoot through his inner visual landscape, and he then tries to identify them. So the mistakes that he was making in the ESP task, we thought, are occurring at this secondary stage. The image is there, it's got the information, but he has trouble identifying it in the same way that he was having trouble seeing these briefly presented slides of the same stuff. So next thought is, well, something must be going on in that noodle just before he makes his response that might tell us whether it was a good response or a bad one. Maybe we could find that out by applying electrodes, EEG electrodes, to his scalp. And it was at that point, I could never get J.B. Ryan interested in doing that kind of an experiment. So I migrated at that point over to the electrical engineering department at Duke University, because there were guys over there in that department who were already interested in this kind of work. And there was a man there, a professor of electrical engineering, a very distinguished guy, who would shelter me from normal academic hostilities in that environment. So that was great. And I spent the next 10 years actually over there trying to develop a program of that sort. There's a kind of story about this on our DOPS website. And one thing I want to make sure we get out, people should really, if they want to find out more about lots of things, but particularly about DOPS itself, just Google on DOPS UVA and you'll go right to our website.
Yep, that stands for the Department of Perceptual Studies.
The Division of Perceptual Studies, yeah.
A division, okay.
We're a research unit housed administratively within the Department of Psychiatry and Neurobehavioral Sciences in the medical school at UVA.